Day for Donald Trump ahead of what will be a very consequential week for the criminally convicted former president and the country. In less than an hour, Trump will take the stage in Philadelphia for his last rally before his first 2024 debate with President Biden in Atlanta on Thursday. Earlier today, Trump addressed the conservative Faith and Freedom Coalition, where he praised mobsters and railed against the justice system.
The weaponization of law enforcement is the greatest threat to freedom in America today, I think, and nobody knows it better than me. The late, great Al Capone, right? I tell it all the time, Scarface. He didn't go through what I went through. I got indicted more than him, sir. For nothing, for no crimes.
Trump also repeated his usual lies about voter fraud just days before the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The High Court's right-wing supermajority agreed to hear Trump's presidential immunity claim more than 3 months ago, and its long-delayed decision is already a victory for Trump. Trump's federal election interference trial has gone from a March start date to legal limbo as the lower court and the rest of us await the Supreme Court's decision. And with each passing day, it becomes less and less likely that before the next election, Donald Trump will be held accountable for trying to overturn the last one. Former Supreme Court clerk Leah Littman says the justices' dithering about Trump is far more than fishy. It's rotten. She writes in the New York Times, quote, "There are, of course, explanations that have nothing to do with politics for why a ruling still hasn't been issued. But the reasons to think something is rotten at the court are impossible to ignore." Littman calls Trump's arguments for immunity, quote, "outlandish," especially the idea that a president would have to have an impeachment conviction before they could be punished for any crime. As a reminder, this is what Trump's lawyers said back in April about whether a commander-in-chief could get away with murder.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
It could.
Okay, look, I'm no lawyer, but you'd think it would take less than 58 days to rule that nonsense unconstitutional. Joining me now, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer for Slate, and Leah Littman, professor at the University of Michigan Law School and former Supreme Court law clerk, who is also co-host of the podcast Strict Scrutiny. Thank you both very much for coming to the Saturday show. So, Leah, let me go back to something you wrote in the New York Times. You wrote, "There are, of course, explanations that have nothing to do with politics for why a ruling still hasn't been issued in the presidential immunity case." What could those explanations be?
So possible good faith explanations include things like, look, the case was argued in April and the Supreme Court still has cases outstanding from when they heard arguments in December. Just yesterday, it resolved a case that had been argued in November. So it's not surprising that a case argued in April would kind of fall to the bottom of the barrel as far as cases that end up being resolved closer to the term. But
immunity case, what could those explanations be?
So possible good faith explanations include things like, look, the case was argued in April and the Supreme Court still has cases outstanding from when they heard arguments in December. Just yesterday, it resolved a case that had been argued in November. So it's not surprising that a case argued in April would kind of fall to the bottom of the barrel as far as cases that end up being resolved closer to the term. But there are also so many reasons to think that just isn't sufficient to explain what's going on here, in particular, given how quickly they resolved the Colorado disqualification case in favor of Donald Trump. There, they quickly restored Donald Trump to the ballot in time for Super Tuesday, and they did so within 50 days or 50-some days of actually deciding to hear the case. And here, it's been over 100 days since they decided to take the immunity case, and Jack Smith had actually asked them to take it up 2 months before that. So they have been delaying this case and acted much more quickly in many others.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, I just want to drill down on something, because the immunity question boils down to the definition of official acts. So where do you think the justices will draw the line on that?
So, look, I think this is going to be a muddled decision that doesn't give a clear victory to either side. I think the three liberals would love to give a clear victory to Jack Smith. They think that all of this is ridiculous nonsense with no basis in the Constitution. I tend to agree with them. But Chief Justice John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett were looking for some kind of compromise during oral arguments. So I think what they'll end up doing is send this back down to the lower court and have her parse the difference in the acts that Trump is alleged to have committed here, whether it's official within his presidential duties or unofficial, like, for instance, trying to create a slate of fake electors who would give Trump an illegitimate majority in the Electoral College. Two problems with that. First, it's going to run out the clock even more. That's going to take months in the lower courts, if not even longer. There will be an appeal that'll end back up at SCOTUS. But also, and I think this is crucial, it really takes the heart out of Jack Smith's case, right? The whole argument here that the special prosecutor has brought is that the president weaponized his constitutional powers in order to halt the peaceful transition of power to a new president and essentially stand in the way of democracy. That should be, in the view of the special counsel of the United States government, that should be a criminal offense. We should be able to put that in front of a jury and say this man committed a crime. But what the Supreme Court may well end up doing in order to salvage part of this case is to say, well, anything Trump did that fell under his constitutional authority, even if he was misusing that authority in an anti-constitutional way, that receives some kind of protection. In short, get ready for a big mess.
I mean, Leah, listening to Mark, I'm sitting here thinking that the legitimacy, if the court does what Mark is predicting, the legitimacy of the court will be supremely, no pun intended, supremely in question. And I want to come back to also something you wrote in the New York Times where you said, this whole thing is rotten in terms of the delay in the immunity case. What is the evidence of something rotten? And does it get to the overall problem of the legitimacy in the eyes of the public, the legitimacy of the court?
So there's so much wrong. I don't want to take up your entire program. But, one thing is that they have managed to act much more quickly, as I was noting, in cases that benefited Donald Trump and also the Republican Party. If you think back to when challengers challenged the President Biden's test or vaccination program, the court managed to rule on that within 2 weeks. So that was a divided decision. And yet they managed to get that one out. So even if there is disagreement in the immunity decision, that doesn't actually explain why it is taking so much longer than other decisions that have engendered disagreement. And again, they managed to affect the timing in ways that seem to benefit one side versus the other.
Right.
And
okay, so let me stop you right there, Leah, because the question I was trying to get to is, as a result of all this, do you think Chief Justice Roberts has lost control of the court?
Absolutely. I mean, look at how his colleagues are behaving. You have Justice Alito practically thumbing his nose at democracy, law, and everything else that should matter to this country. And the Chief Justice isn't really in a position to do anything about it, or at least he hasn't even attempted to. Because some of the other evidence for why we should think something is wrong at the court is, of course, the fact that Justice Alito's homes displayed multiple flags associated with the Stop the Steal movement, which, of course, is also behind the Trump immunity claim, as well as another January 6th case that is outstanding at the Supreme Court that could take away some of the additional charges in the election interference case against Donald Trump. So, yes, it seems as though the Chief Justice has lost control of this court, or at least he has not done nearly enough to rein it in. As to whether this is going to affect the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the eyes of the public, I guess from my perspective, my concern is that the media might translate a split ruling of the kind that Mark was describing as a compromise or a middle-of-the-road balance, when in reality, it would decline to reject a completely outlandish position and in the process hand Donald Trump a significant victory by allowing him to continue to run out the clock and prevent a jury of his peers from deciding whether he engaged in illegal election interference.
Mark, let me get you on one more thing about something you wrote about in the Rahimi decision, and that's the great 8-1 decision that said, oh my, domestic abusers should not be able to have guns. Great decision. But you write, the headline of your piece is why Rahimi decision on preventing domestic abusers to own guns isn't all good news. Real quick.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Supreme Court did not foreclose future wacky Second Amendment challenges to common sense gun restrictions. The court left the door open and said, well, this one goes too far. We're not going to arm domestic abusers today. But it declined to walk back its broader loony and I think anti-historical position on a very robust individual right to bear arms. I'll also say this case gave the conservative justices an opportunity to walk back some of their extremism on originalism. And a few of them kind of took it, but none of them acknowledged that they were the reason that lower courts had issued this rash of wacky decisions like the one at issue, arming domestic abusers. None of the conservatives would say, yeah, we got it wrong. We went too far. We used unworkable tests and language and bad history, and we need to take a clear, more legible approach to the law. They would not admit a single bit of fault. And so that suggests to me they aren't really chastened. They say, yeah, we'll be the adults in the room when we need to, but they will continue to